directed to remove as much of the material dropped by the balloon as possible. Sometimes this was difficult because the balloon and payload would break apart and cover a large area. We collected the debris in these cases by fanning out across the field until we had collected even very small portions of the payload and balloon. We were particularly careful to recover the large plastic balloons because cattle would ingest the material and the ranchers would file claims against the government. Additionally, there were reward notices that offered $25 for the return of the equipment attached to each of the balloons. I wrote a book, The Long Lonely Leap, E.P. Dutton and Company, 1961, that completely describes Project Excel projects. I trained balloon pilots in May 1959 at the request of Colonel Stapp. Colonel Stapp was concerned that I might be injured as a result of the hazardous nature of the projects, and he wanted backup pilots to be trained. The backup pilots, Captain Dan Fulgham and Captain Bill Kaufman, were volunteers from the Aeromedical Laboratory, and they were sent to Holloman from Wright-Patterson for training on a temporary duty basis. On our second training flight, Fulgham, Kaufman, and I flew an overnight mission that was launched at Holloman and ended with a crash northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. We were followed on this mission by an aircraft at night, a helicopter during the day, and a ground crew in trucks at all times. I recall that just after sunrise the weather had deteriorated and I directed Fulgham to land the balloon in a small field. This was the last suitable field before we would overfly the city of Roswell. I remember approaching the field just over the trees, and I recall our forward velocity was about 10 to 12 knots, a little fast for landing. When we touched down, Fulgham cut the balloon away, and due to the forward velocity, the gondola flipped over, spilling all three of us on the ground. While lying on the ground, I realized that Fulgham was injured, and Kaufman and I raised the gondola. Fulgham had been struck in the head by the edge of the gondola, and I could see the blood rapidly accumulating under his scalp in the forehead area. We treated him for shock, and soon the recovery vehicles and the chase helicopter arrived. I decided to transport Fulgham by helicopter to the hospital at nearby Walker Air Force Base. When we arrived at Walker, I remember that security was tight, as it was at all Strategic Air Command bases, and we were closely scrutinized by security personnel due to the unusual circumstances and early hour of our arrival. I had two concerns once we arrived at the hospital. First, to get treatment for Fulgham, and second, to leave as soon as possible. After I was assured that Fulgham's injuries were not serious, I wanted to quickly leave the base before the Walker Air Force Base flying safety officer arrived to fill out an accident report. I didn't want a report filled out because an accident investigation would bring unwanted scrutiny to the project. Even though the project was unclassified, I did not want any publicity or premature releases of information. Although Fulgham's injuries were not serious, his head had swollen considerably. Both eyes were black and his face had swollen so much you could barely see his nose. I believe that if someone saw him while we were at Walker, they would have been startled. When his treatment was completed, we all three returned to Holloman on the helicopter. At Holloman, Fulgham was admitted to the hospital, and I made preparations for him to return to his duty station at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Due to his grotesque appearance, I did not want Fulgham to fly on a commercial airline. I made arrangements for all of us to fly to Wright-Patterson on a C-131 a few days later. When we arrived at Wright-Patterson, I assisted Fulgham down the steps of the aircraft because his eyes were swollen shut and he could not see. His wife was waiting at the bottom of the steps of the aircraft, and she asked me where her husband was. I replied, "This is your husband," and she screamed and began to cry. While I was at the Walker Air Force Base Hospital, I do not recall any contact with a male civilian. I certainly did not call anyone an SOB or speak to anyone in a disrespectful manner. I did not make any threats or instruct anyone else to make threats. I recall nurses in the hospital, but I am not certain if they participated in the treatment of Captain Fulgham. I was not accompanied by a black NCO at the hospital, but there may have been a black NCO on the balloon recovery team. I recall no body bags in the hospital, and I am sure there were no aliens in the hospital, just Dan Fulgham with a very odd-looking head injury. I was also involved in the Joint Air Force, Navy, and Massachusetts Institute of Technology Astronomical Observation Project, Project Stargazer. The object of this project was to make observations via a stabilized telescope mounted atop of a gondola suspended from a high-altitude balloon. I was the U.S. Air Force project officer, and Dr. J. Allen Hynek was the scientific advisor. I worked very closely with Dr. Hynek over a period of 5 years, from 1958 to 1963. Dr. Hynek would typically spend half a day working on Stargazer and then the rest of the day participating as one of the consultants on the UFO study, Project Blue Book, that was also conducted at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Dr. Hynek, as the scientific advisor to Stargazer, was very familiar with the techniques and capabilities of the Air Force high-altitude balloon program. Dr. Hynek once approached me and we discussed at length the possibility that Air Force high-altitude balloons were responsible for many UFO sightings. We ended the conversation in agreement that the balloons probably accounted for many of the UFO sightings. In other conversations, Dr. Hynek always gave me the impression that there were very few UFO sightings that could not be explained by good scientific investigation. At no time did Dr. Hynek mention or discuss the alleged Roswell incident. I was therefore flabbergasted when Dr. Hynek appeared to believe that some of these sightings were of an extraterrestrial origin. I am not part of any conspiracy to withhold or provide misleading information to the United States government or the American public. There is no classified information that I am withholding related to this inquiry, and I have never been threatened by U.S. government persons concerning refraining from talking about this matter. Signed, Joseph W. Kittinger, Jr., Colonel, U.S. Air Force, retired. Statement of Witness. Date 31 May 95. I, Roland H. Lutz, Chief Master Sergeant, U.S. Air Force, retired, hereby state that James McAndrew was identified as a lieutenant, U.S. Air Force Reserve, on this date at my home, and do hereby, voluntarily, and of my own free will, make the following statement. This was done without having been subjected to any coercion, unlawful influence, or unlawful inducement. I enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1947 and transferred to the U.S. Air Force in 1958. In June 1958, I was assigned to the Flight Surgeon's Office at Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, as an aeromedical technician. I served several tours in Southeast Asia and retired from the Air Force in 1974 as an aeromedical. In 1959, I was assigned to provide medical coverage for a balloon training mission that took off from Holloman Air Force Base and ended with a crash near Roswell, New Mexico. Captain Joe Kittinger was training 2 other pilots, Captain Fulgham and Captain Kaufman. I followed the balloon in an ambulance during the night, and at daybreak, I followed the balloon in an H-21 helicopter. Just after daybreak, I saw the balloon crash, and the 3 pilots were dumped from the gondola. I immediately informed the helicopter pilot, and we landed in a field on which cattle were grazing. I recall the rancher was upset because the helicopter was frightening his cattle, and some cattle had gotten out of the field. I assessed the injuries to the pilots and recommended they be taken immediately to the closest hospital, which was Walker Air Force Base, approximately 5 to 10 minutes away by helicopter. Captain Fulgham's head was swelling due to a hematoma he received when the gondola struck him. Captain Kittinger was cut on the face and was bleeding. Captain Kaufman was uninjured. At Walker, I remember a telephone conversation with a flight surgeon who told me to go home and sleep it off. He apparently did not believe my story of 3 Air Force pilots that were victims of a balloon crash. However, I was able to convince him, and he treated Captain Fulgham and Captain Kittinger. While at the hospital, Captain Fulgham's head had swelled enormously and his eyes were beginning to turn black. I do not recall that anything unusual occurred at the hospital at Walker. I remember the 3 pilots sitting on a bench in the hallway waiting to be treated. I do not remember that Captain Kittinger was involved in an altercation with anyone while at the hospital. If he had, I would have known about it. Captain Kittinger was concerned with getting medical treatment for his injured crew member, Captain Fulgham, and returning to Holloman. I also do not recall a black NCO accompanying Captain Kittinger while we were at the hospital. I do not remember a nurse assisting in the treatment of Captain Fulgham or Captain Kittinger. I also do not remember a male civilian or any personnel or vehicles from a mortuary, and I do not recall any remains in body bags in the hospital. I was present the entire time when the events described here took place. I am certain that this event had nothing to do with space aliens or any other irregular activity that would require a cover-up. It was a balloon crash and nothing else. I am not part of any conspiracy to withhold or provide misleading information to the United States government or the American public. There is no classified information that I am withholding related to this inquiry, and I have never been threatened by U.S. government persons concerning refraining from talking about this matter. Signed, Roland H. Lutz, Chief Master Sergeant, U.S. Air Force, retired. Statement of Witness. Date 20 June 95. I, Raymond A. Madsen, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Air Force, retired, hereby state that James McAndrew was identified as a Lieutenant, U.S. Air Force Reserve, on this date at my place of employment, and do hereby, voluntarily, and of my own free will, make the following statement. This was done without having been subjected to any coercion, unlawful influence, or unlawful inducement. I was born, raised, and presently reside in New Mexico. I graduated from New Mexico A&M College in 1954. I entered the Air Force in 1955 and was assigned a short time later to the Aeromedical Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio. At the Aeromedical Laboratory, I was assigned to the Escape Section as a project officer and test parachutist. During this time, I also had extensive participation in various aspects of the space program and worked on the highly classified U-2 project. I served a tour of duty in Alaska and at the School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks Air Force Base, Texas, before being reassigned to the Aeromedical Laboratory at Wright-Patterson. I retired from the Air Force in 1979, and I am currently an environmental specialist for the state of New Mexico. The first project that I was assigned at Wright-Patterson was Project 7218, later changed to Project 7222. This project was first known by the name High Dive and then was known as Excelsior. The object of this project was to study the freefall characteristics of anthropomorphic dummies from balloons at altitudes of 50,000 to 100,000 feet. Following satisfactory dummy drops, Captain Joe Kittinger made a series of high-altitude parachute jumps that culminated with a jump from 102,800 feet. I assumed the duties of project officer for the dummy drops in the spring of 1956. I made numerous trips to Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, the site of the drops, from 1956 until the end of the project in 1959. Dummies were also dropped for this project at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base by personnel from the parachute branch. I wrote 2 technical reports that described the project in considerable detail. The type of anthropomorphic dummy used primarily was manufactured by Alderson Laboratories, but we also used Sierra Manufacturing type dummies. Both of these dummies are shown in the technical reports. The Alderson dummy had facial features that were not lifelike and ears that were not well defined. The dummies were outfitted with flight suits of various colors, fuchsia, olive drab, and sage green, a shade of gray. We chose the Alderson dummy because it was relatively inexpensive as compared to the Sierra dummy. We encountered considerable difficulty dropping the dummies from the balloons. I designed the rack that suspended the dummies, 2 at a time, from the balloon. On numerous occasions, the dummies were fouled during the release sequence, and the dummy rode a streamer all the way to the ground. Other times, malfunctions occurred that caused the 2 dummies and the entire rack assembly to descend to the ground as one package. Both of these instances are described in the technical reports. I participated in at least 2 dummy recoveries. The meteorologist from the balloon branch, Duke Gildenberg, would determine the best place to launch the balloons depending on the prevailing weather conditions. Duke also